We are here for part 2 with Ivan Farber. My name is David DeCelle, president with Model FA, and super excited to bring you this week's episode with Ivan. So in our first episode, we had discussed conversations, of course, primarily, I would say, the overall strategy from maybe like a 10,000 foot view or so. And today we're going to get into the nitty gritty on how do you actually set up a system and how do you plan. So I know that there's, really 5 main topics that we're going to discuss today, Ivan. So we're going to figure out how to prepare and plan for the people that are on your calendar. We're going to talk about creating, exploring, addressing, and then ultimately resolving and gaining agreement for action. So before we dive in, of course, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. That's a sign of a good first conversation is the opportunity to come back.
Exactly. Well, we did say in there that we're going to have a part 2, so maybe it's an obligatory conversation, but I'm just kidding. But we are working on a special project that I'll send a teaser out there where we are going to take all of these principles and we're going to do a little mini series on each of these different topics, dive a little bit deeper in each one. So stay tuned for that, probably end of Q1, beginning-ish of Q2. I'm putting that out in the universe to, hold us accountable to following through. So more to come on that, but let's dive right in because we got a lot to get through. So Ivan, in your book, right, there's a section that's called preparing and planning for these conversations. So I guess my first question to you is, when you see someone coming up on your calendar, right, how do you come up with the talking points on a per person basis?
I think of talking points on 2 tracks. There's the talking points that are universal and can be applied to every conversation, and the talking points that are going to be specific to those clients' needs or prospects' needs. So to talk a little bit more about that, there's the overwhelmingly important part is presenting that you can help somebody. You have to be able to demonstrate you have needs and we can solve them. And that's a little bit universal, how you solve needs, being very articulate with how you do that. Then there's what's going on right now in the news. Obviously, right now, there's a lot of things in the news, although I would say there's always something in the news. But that's where I would divide the 2. So I want to bring both the existing material as well as think about that conversation specifically.
So unpack that more. I want very specific stuff. So when you say, so those 2 categories, can you give additional examples on that? So pretend that you're talking, well, I guess you don't have to pretend that you're talking to me, but pretend that we're in, pretend that we're in a financial planning oriented conversation. Okay. Sure. How would you handle that? And you don't need to go through like the actual talk track, but like bullet points of certain questions that you may ask or topics that you may hit on. What would some of those things be?
Okay, so for the purposes of this, I'm going to assume, although we can go different directions, that you're an existing client and this is like our annual review.
Okay.
So preparing in general, where are we in the year? We're at the beginning of the year. What is my firm's point of view about the world? But that's only for much later in the conversation. The specifically preparing for you, David, as my client who I haven't talked to in a year, one of the first things I'm going to do is go back and read my notes of previous conversations. I'm going to think about where you are in the world. I'm going to think about rapport items, like if you and I have been seeing each other on Instagram, for example. I'm going to think about that. I'm going to think about what's going on in your life. So I'm always going to have a rapport plan. Rapport being something we've talked about in the last episode. I'm going to think about what your needs are. And I'm also going to think about, financially speaking, I call this kind of like pushing the envelope forward or pushing the snowball forward. where it starts is we want to make sure people have the confidence that they're not ever going to run out of money. That's kind of the check number one. But beyond that, when you are confident that you're not ever going to run out of money, then we need to start talking about what are you going to do with your money after you. So those are financial needs, but I'm also, and I write about this in chapter 4 of the book on needs. So I'm really thinking, if you're familiar with Abraham Maslow's pyramid of needs, I'm always thinking, how do I push the client up the pyramid? So from survival to affiliation to self-actualization ultimately. So I'm thinking about all those needs going into a conversation.
So what I would add to that too, and I think you breezed over it, but I think in today's day and age, it's incredibly important to make sure that we expand upon this a little bit more. And I think that this is certainly relevant for existing clients, whether it's a review meeting or networking meeting or whatever, but even more so important for prospects that you're meeting for the first time. Is if you're meeting with someone, like try Googling their name and seeing if there was any publication, seeing if they received any awards, make sure that you're looking up their LinkedIn profile, see what's on there, just see if there's any commonalities. Like I have a client of mine who's into ultimate Frisbee, and that's literally in part of his tagline. And he's an advisor out of Seattle, and there was a woman who reached out to him who's very successful, who's in the financial planning process, that connected with him, or reached out to him, I should say, because of the connection that they had with their ultimate Frisbee passion. Totally random, right? But what I like to tell people is that social media does a great job at leaving clues as to what people are into, where their passions lie. And if they're a prospect, maybe if you see something like, they're, I don't know, into a certain sports team or something like that, you may not want to say, hey, I was doing some creeping and I came across your profile and, saw that you like this sort of sports team or whatever, but you could like weave that into the conversation somehow. Like, oh, did you see what the Red Sox just did? And, then they're like, oh my God, I love the Red Sox. And, you kind of have that common connection. So I think it's important to make sure that for all, especially new people, when rapport hasn't yet been built, that you do your digging, you do your research. And if it was a referral, which hopefully a lot of, the people that you're meeting with are referrals. If it was a referral, ask the nominator, the person who made the introduction, what's the most unique thing about them? And then you can bring that up, like, hey, Ivan was telling me that, whatever that is, right? You're really into fly fishing, right? You're really into, I'm using all these client examples of these quirky things. Or, you're really into, gardening or windsurfing or whatever it is. And then boom, you can talk about that, right? So I think it's important to just note that social media leaves clues and utilize that to its full extent in order to build rapport. Because I feel like what you said was part building rapport and part building credibility and influence over them, so that you can be the logical person making the decisions, with them, as opposed to them being emotionally driven to whatever decisions they think are appropriate.
Before you ask the next question, I want to build on that and say another thing that I do. And you're absolutely right that you have to tell the prospect or client, hey, don't get creeped out by this. But I looked at things. I'll, of course, do a map view. I'll do Google Maps, and I'll look at a satellite view of their house and the street view. I'll look for rapport points and again, I'll bring it up to them, say, hey, I was curious where you live. So I just happened to Google it. And I saw the picture of your house. And in the picture, there's a guy with a lawnmower on the street view. Is that you? So I've even done that. And then also Redfin and Zillow often have pictures of the inside of people's houses. And so I always let them know, hey, I also looked up the house on Zillow. I was curious, what your neighborhood was like. Okay, yes, I'm a financial guy, so was curious how much you paid for your house. But it has these great pictures. I love that. I love that game room. I love that man cave. So those are also along the lines of what you mentioned. some techniques I've used.
Cool. I will say, if I'm being totally honest, you certainly have more courage than me. I don't know if I'd be able to do that right off the bat, but if you've done it and it's been well received and they still ended up doing business, by all means. But you'd certainly have more courage than me in that regard.
Well, so I do have a bit of courage, but like, for instance, the example you gave about ultimate frisbee, if you already know that going in, of course, last time we talked about, and I talk about in my book, asking, especially at the beginning, asking very broad questions like, what are your hobbies and interests? So you ask, knowing that the client or prospect plays ultimate frisbee, you ask, what are your hobbies and interests? Very broad, open-ended question, and see what they share with you. So you don't necessarily play all your cards from Redfin and Zillow and Google Maps, but you assemble the cards.
I gotcha.
Oh, well, LinkedIn, I will go back and look at their entire career, not because I'm going to go through it with them, but because I'm going to get a sense of their psychographics and their career history. So like if they had been a manager, for example, then I might speak to them differently than if they had been a line worker or whatever it is.
Gotcha. So in the next section, which is, create, right? You had mentioned something to the effect of an opening statement or consultative opener. So my first question is, are those the same things or are they different when you use that terminology?
I mean, they're a Venn diagram that are almost on top of each other.
So tell me more.
Yeah, the training that I went to was now about 25 years ago. It's called Socratic Selling Skills. So you think Socrates is going to lead a dialogue by asking questions, but you do have to be careful at the start. You don't want to alarm people that you're going to be prying into their situation. So the Socratic opener is something that or consultative opener goes like this. David, I'm fully prepared to talk with you about our company, about our services, and about how we can help you. In order that I focus this conversation on you, would you be willing to elaborate on what brings you here today? So it's always a statement of confidence and competence. Like, I'm fully prepared to talk with you, but in order that we focus on what's most important to you, let's start. What's most important to you?
And maybe I missed it. Was that an example of an opening statement or consultative opener, or are they kind of one and the same? Help me understand that.
That's a consultative opener.
Okay. Give me an example of, excuse me, give me an example of an opening statement. Is that more of so it sounds like the consultative opener ends with a question, and maybe the other one, the opening statement, is just a statement. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, you are. And I'll elaborate. Okay. So you have your consultative or Socratic opener. We'll just call it consultative because I don't want to give royalties to Socrates for using his name too much. I write about in this chapter 7, the Socratic opener, the consultative opener, and what I call the tripartite agenda. Tripartite meaning comes in threes. So I've found that stating an agenda that has 3 items on it works for people. And then to the conversation that we had a couple of whiles ago on my show about LIFO versus FIFO, clients pick up the last in. Okay, so and you can do it in either order. I could say, David, I had 3 things in mind for today. 1, I want to get an update on you and how you're doing in your life. 2, I want to give you an update on what we're thinking and what we're doing with your money. And then 3, I want to make sure that we talk about this year to come and align about what you're going to need this year. Does that work for you? Then you either accept it or add to it or modify it, but the key in the model is you're going to agree to this as the agenda. Now, admittedly, it's very generic, and that's totally intentional, because Then I could do the consultative opener and say, okay, that's my agenda. But look, so that we start with what's most important to you, would you be willing to share, David, what's on your plate? What's on your agenda today?
Okay, so you're basically stating your agenda, asking what theirs is, and they're probably going to stay within the boundaries that you put out there already. Is that what tends to happen?
I mean, they're so broad. If I say, give you an update, get an update, and address anything that you need, there's no real boundaries yet. I think of conversations as starting broad and coming narrow.
Mm-hmm.
Start as broad as you can, but again, you're interested in what's most important to them.
So maybe you actually did the opposite and I misinterpreted it, where you got rid of the boundaries so that they can go in whatever direction that they want, to then allow you to know what your boundaries are.
It's Jedi. It's Jedi stuff. It's setting boundaries and letting them know I'm prepared without putting this conversation in a box.
Gotcha. Okay, I gotcha. So in the third section, or I guess technically this would be the 8th section in the book, but third section for today, the explore section. So in that chapter, you mentioned the idea of open-ended and closed-ended probing concepts. Give me an example of open-ended probing, and typically at what point in the meeting are you bringing that up?
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. Before, though, to help those playing along in the home game, we are talking about 4 specific parts of the conversation model. The acronym, and I'm fond of acronyms, is clear. So we've talked about create. I have forced in the letter L because I believe in having clear conversations, and because CEAR doesn't help you. But so create, listen or learn, explore, address, resolve. And the other thing I like about it is I want each segment to be clear. So before we go on to explore, I'm going to check for agreement and say, okay, here's the agenda. Does that work for you? You say yes. We agree on what we're talking about. And conversations will often go off the rails, and you may, within the course of a conversation, have to come back to, what exactly are we talking about?
Kind of like this one a little bit.
Well, I just seized control of the conversation to take it to a larger point of view that now
I'm glad you did.
Answer your question. Just,
okay.
To help the people. David, we do this for the people.
I love it.
Okay. So we're in the E of clear. Your question was when to use an open-ended question and when to use a closed-ended question.
And examples of each.
An open-ended question is used to gather facts and feelings and motivations and needs and wants. And an open-ended question actually controls and steers the conversation. Closed-ended question is used to confirm, gain agreement, engage people. And so in the book, this is chapter 8, I share 9 open-ended probes or questions. And these are terms that I made up. So I feel like there's some IP there, proprietary intellectual property, but I'm happy to give them away. And I'll talk about those. And then there's also closed-ended. But specifically the question of when. It's said in football that a good running game sets up the passing game. And the same is true in using questions to explore. A good base of open-ended questions sets up a closed-ended question. You always want to open the dialogue. If you use closed-ended questions, you'll close things off too quickly. But it's not a matter of, okay, I'm done my open-ended questions. Now I'll move on to my closed-end questions. It's more a matter of, and why I use the football metaphor is, okay, we're going to run on first down. Then we'll either run or pass on second down. And then on third down. So it may be open, open, closed, open, closed. It's actually the sequence of open and closed-ended questions that makes the difference.
So if we're in a conversation with, say, a prospect who is not obviously yet a client, and you're trying to gather more information from them, what's an example of an open-ended question that would in turn be followed up by a closed-ended question, just so that the listeners can hear a real life example?
David, and I'm going to mini role play this. David, what's important to you as you're looking for a financial professional?
I think someone who, number one, I get along with. Number two is competent in what they do. And number three would be to challenge my thinking and get me to think bigger than what I was thinking before. That would be my top three criteria.
So someone who challenges you, someone who's competent, and someone who understands you. Is that correct?
Yes. However, yes. It was out of order, so it threw me off for a second, but yes.
I went LIFO. I went LIFO because admittedly, the first thing you said fell out of my head. And so I figured I would go last in, first out.
There you go.
But that was an open-ended question. It was a what's important to you about what you're looking for. And then it was a closed-ended, which was active listening, was restating what you said. And then the closed-ended question part of that was, is it correct? Am I correct? Or is it correct?
Gotcha. So
that was open, closed.
That was open, active listening, and then closed, right? Because the closing wasn't the repeating the whole thing. The closing was just the question at the end.
Exactly. And then the next to go next from there, in case you're wanting to see what's next, then I could go open or close depending on what I want. So I said, is that correct? And then you modified, or at least you were questioning, did Ivan really hear me? And that is what a lot of people do. It's like, was I really heard? And so either A, I want to have the self-control to just button my lip and let you keep going. B, do something of a easy probe, like tell me more, or ask a closed-ended question. When you say competent, I could go closed or opened here. And this is the control that I talk about in my book and that I coach to, is having the control to say, okay, you said the word competent. That's of the three, that's the one I'm going to go with. I'm going to ask you, what's your definition of competent? I'm thinking ahead, like I'm going to sell you whatever you tell me you believe demonstrates competence.
I like that you just said that. I think that's a very important piece for people to really hit on, and for us to highlight, is get that. And I'm going to share an example as well, where get them to tell you what you need to do, and then just do that. And, say, hey, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned X, Y, and Z, and we had determined X, Y, and Z, let's get to work, type of thing. So one thing I ask a lot when I was an advisor, or if an advisor is coming to me now who's worked with a coach or a consultant in the past, I'll ask them and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, right? 10 meaning that you're going to have them over for dinner and work with them the rest of your life, and 1 meaning you are actively shopping and looking around, and that you basically already left them. How would you grade your relationship with them? And typically they say anywhere from like 5, 6 to 7, but no one ever really says a 1, and no one really says a 10. So even if they say an 8, well, great. Then I'm going to follow up and say, well, what would they need to do, or what would they have needed to do to go from an 8 to a 10? And then whatever they say, that's what you have to do. And then you can ask a follow-up question, say, that's fantastic. Why were they an 8, right? What did they do to get, over that 5, over that 6, over that 7? And then boom, they just gave you everything that they're looking for. And they're not even a lot of the times conscious enough to realize that they're giving you the information that you need to sell them. So all those questions, I think, are incredibly important, to your point, Ivan, to basically use that, to your advantage when it comes the point in time where you're asking them to take action on whatever that action step is. So appreciate you bringing that up.
Now, if you're thinking chess, and I definitely believe in playing conversational chess versus conversational checkers, in that sequence of what do you find credible, they may very well say, I don't know, what should I find credible? Or I haven't really thought about it. That's a very common answer. So you have to think in that planning part, knowing the person, knowing their history, knowing where they're at, knowing maybe who their current provider is. You have to start to do kind of detective work in advance. But this is where questions, I would call it hypotheticals or sub-decision questions. If they said something like, geez, I don't know what I would consider competent. And I would say, well, and I would have to go like a two-part question or multiple choice rather than, well, what do you find? Because you're asking an open-ended question, but it's open for them. I would say, well, do you find designations credible or do you find longevity credible? And if they say, well, actually they need both. Now you have two clues for what you can do. Then you say, well, do you think it's important that the person is maybe kind of famous who's making the decisions for you? Or would you prefer to have someone more exclusive so that other people don't know about them? Oh no, I would want the famous person. I would want the guy who has the podcast and has the articles. So you're just basically asking them to lay out what are their criteria for buying.
And you're getting feedback from them. And, if they don't end up becoming a client, at least they've given you insight as to what a consumer is looking for. So you can improve in that. So then that's a little bit, of a tangent here, but and I share this with people all the time, whether you win or lose or something indifferent happens, it doesn't matter. I think if you're actively learning, so we've been talking about actively listening, if you're actively learning, there's no situation that you're going to come across to where you can't get better because of. So the three questions that I always try and ask myself in those situations are, what did I do to put myself in this situation, right? Extreme ownership. Side note, Extreme Ownership by Jocko is a great book. What did I do to put myself in this situation? What am I supposed to learn? And how am I going to get better because of it? And if you do that through that active learning exercise, that self-awareness exercise, and then you actually do something about it, every interaction, every step that you take throughout every single day, you're getting better and better and better because you're just living a much more conscious life than, whining that someone didn't become a client and blaming it on them. It's like, no, look yourself in the mirror. What could you have done differently? So tangent, but I thought it was helpful to share.
Valuable. I wrote valuable tangent. I wrote down Extreme Ownership.
I saw you taking notes.
Taking notes because you have a lot to give around books. So I think we wrap up this section on the E in clear of explore with actually the word clear, which is sometimes people are asking questions either for question's sake because someone told them, you better ask questions. You got to ask more questions. I think it's really important to say in the needs-based model that I espouse, you're probing for needs. So if it's like competence, why is that important, right? You're starting, if it's competence, if it's whatever it is that's important to them, but underneath it is what is the need? Well, the need is probably making sure I don't run out of money, making sure good decisions are made, whatever the need is, but you want them to say it. And the phrase that is my mantra is you're looking to get a clear, complete, and mutual understanding of their needs. So it's not a vague understanding. It's not an incomplete understanding. And it's not what you think you understand. It's a clear, complete, and mutual understanding.
Making sure you're on the same page. Love it. So let's go to the the A in clear, which is address. So I have a couple questions that I do want to ask. So part of this section, from my understanding, is how to address certain things that come up in conversations specifically objections. And what you mention in the book is that there are 4 main types of objections. And once you say your piece, I'm going to share something as well, because I love dealing with objections, because I feel like they're almost like a knee-jerk reaction. They're not actually real. A lot of the times, sometimes they are very real, but whatever the first thing they say isn't enough information to be able to reply directly. So I don't want to steal your thunder, but I'll tag you back in. What are the 4 types of objections that people commonly bring up throughout conversations?
Number 1, skepticism.
Okay.
Number 2, drawbacks.
Okay.
Number 3, misunderstandings. And number 4 is indifference.
Okay. So let's start with skepticism. Skepticism in you, skepticism in the process, skepticism in the recommendation, skepticism in all the above.
D, all of the above.
Do you think that if it was a very strong referral and the nominator did a great job, not just teeing you up, but teeing up the process and the planning and things like that, do you think skepticism would be a relevant objection more often than not? Or if the nominator did a good job of teeing them up, do you think that that kind of goes by the wayside?
The first, I would say skepticism is present always and everywhere. So let's just define skepticism. Skepticism is the idea that your client or prospect doubts a feature or benefit of something that you've said, or even something you haven't said, but there's doubt. And so even if you got teed up, like if Michael Van Sant referred me to you, and I'm still going to be skeptical of you, David, because even though Mike said it, I need to see for myself what David is like and what the experience of knowing David and working with David is like.
So do you not trust Mike? No, I'm just kidding.
Shout out to Michael Van Sant. I do trust Mike, but like any human being, we've all been burned. Just because you got a good haircut from XYZ salon doesn't mean, and you're looking good.
Thanks, man.
It doesn't mean that I'll get a good haircut from them. So just like when someone has a good experience with a financial advisor and you're like, you should go to my guy. A lot of times people say, well, what if I don't like your guy? So one of the tips I give is that people mistake skepticism for being mistrusted, and they're not the same. It is possible that there's mistrust, but it's just possible that they're from Missouri and they just want to be shown the show me state. They just want to walk a mile in the moccasins with you.
So then how do you identify if there's skepticism? Because I picture a lot of people not coming out and saying, well, I'm skeptical of this, right? So it's either intuitive, or there's questions that you ask that get them to admit that or say something similar to where you now know it's skepticism. And how do you respond to that?
Well, and I've seen you do this technique, so I know the tell me if I'm wrong, or I may be wrong about this. But David, it sounds like you're a little skeptical. So you would soften it, but I mean, sometimes it's very clear the person is skeptical.
Yeah,
I
like I was gonna say, I like the phrase too, at the risk of being too direct. And then it's almost like, hey, no offense, but I like telling them what's coming before actually saying that, to your point, to soften it. So if they say, yes, I'm skeptical, then what?
What are you skeptical about?
What do you find people say more often than not in terms of why they're skeptical?
Well, first off, the first thing that they'll say is usually not the thing. That's just what came to mind. And so this is where exercising self-control and peeling down, or as I like to say, let them empty the suitcase of the dirty laundry because the dirtiest laundry is in the bottom.
Mhm.
So the discipline to be, what makes you skeptical? They say something, you say, you either echo, paraphrase, tell me more, and then you keep going. And then you definitely want to active listening and restate. So what I heard you say is the reason you're skeptical is because you just have never delegated to an advisor before. And they say, yeah, that's it. Well, we understand that. And then some kind of validation, like we understand that. We have a lot of clients who never delegated before. And in fact, this is a hard transition for them. So there's then some kind of empathy statement. And since we're in the A of clear and we're talking about address, that is addressing the need, like the need to provide empathy.
So that's skepticism. The second objection is, as a reminder for everyone, and then if you can, including myself, and well, when we list it off and then we talk about one in depth, I got to start taking notes during this, but I'm also, there's video here going too. So the second objection typically is what? And do you have an acronym for this, or can we make one?
We're going to have to make one because that
Okay.
will help you and me. I mean, I have the benefit of writing the book and editing and
Recording
all
the
that.
book. Yeah.
So yeah, and the audio book that I just completed. I'm just making an acronym on the fly here. Skepticism. Dims.
Dims.
We
Okay,
might
so
be able
we're
to do
gonna.
better than that, but
So we're gonna.
drawbacks,
Okay, so drawbacks. Then what?
indifference, misunderstandings, and skepticism.
Okay, so we started from the back, so let's go in that same direction.
All right, misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is when the client or prospect has an understanding that is just incorrect. There's a feature or benefit that they think is either doesn't exist or exists, and they need to be corrected. Their conception of the way it is needs to be corrected.
Now, do you think that's their fault or the advisor's fault for maybe not being clear?
It's always the advisor's fault.
So I'm glad that you said that. And I think oftentimes what advisors will say is they'll go through something that's educational or valuable or whatever, and then they'll follow up with, does that make sense? Okay. Now, if they say, does that make sense? If the person says no, they feel dumb because of that. Okay. So more often than not, they'll just say yes, and then they may not take action because there's a misunderstanding, and you don't even have the opportunity to know that there's a misunderstanding, right? So instead, after you say whatever you say, if you're wondering if it made sense or not, you say, instead of does that make sense, you say, am I making sense as I go through that, or should I be explaining that differently? So it puts it on you to where if they say no, it's your fault, not theirs. And they're more likely to actually speak up in that instance, as opposed to just moving on because they don't want to feel dumb.
Yes. And instead of saying, I think there's a misunderstanding here and blaming them, obviously, in that, it's saying, I'm not sure we're on the same page. Maybe you could help me by telling me, what is your understanding of XYZ? Said a different way, you may have already explained let's say your planning process, and it's clear that they did not understand what you said, which we have to assume mostly. So it might be like, we've just gone over our planning process. What, if any, questions do you have about it? How do you feel about it? What are your thoughts about it? What's your opinion about it? In part one, we talked about the best questions to start with. What do you think? How do you feel? What's your opinion? Mm-hmm. And that just really helps with misunderstandings.
So moving to indifference, I feel like this may be the toughest one because they're indifferent. So it's, do you push? Do you pull? Do you just let them fly on their own? How do you handle indifference where I also interpret indifference as like indecisive too, maybe to a
Could
certain
be.
extent. So how do you deal with someone's indifference, or do you not?
You have to deal with it.
Well, you could, okay, finish your thought. Sorry.
You have to deal with it. The thing is that it is more uncomfortable sometimes than some of the others. I'll give you an example that comes to mind. An advisor will call a client and they'll say, "Is there anything you need?" No. "Do you have any questions?" No. You've got tic tac, and then they usually follow it up with one more no. And you've got tic tac no. They're indifferent because most clients, prospects, if they value the relationship with their advisor, they want to engage. They're not indifferent. And so indifference is often a sign that you're about to lose a client. It's certainly a sign that for a prospect, they're not going to come on board. That's the whole point of conversations, to alter the future. And if they're not engaged, if they're indifferent, you're not going to alter the future. I mean, you'll alter the future, but it won't be with you. The way to handle indifference, and by the way, the book, to plug the book shamelessly, I have a 7-step method for all 4. It's just, boom, 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 boom. But with indifference, you're going to ask for permission to probe. So someone says, "I don't have any questions." I'm going to go with, "Well, may I ask you a couple questions?" I always think it's funny when you say to someone, "May I ask you a question?" You've already asked them one question.
Right.
And I'm kind of a smart guy with that one, where someone says, "May I ask you a question?" I'm like, "You already have, but you can ask me a second one too."
So before we get into the final objection with the new acronym that we came up with for now, unless we think of something else, is D, just because Ivan mentioned it. And if you hadn't listened to the first part of the podcast, be sure to go back to part 1. But if you go to just Amazon.com and type in conversations, just note there's a lot of books that have the word conversations in it. So if you type in conversations, Ivan Farber, Farber, it'll pop up and you can buy it right there. And then here shortly, there will be an audiobook as well. So stay tuned for that. But let's go through the last objection before we wrap up with the R of clear.
And I have a new acronym as well, which I'll present to you shortly.
Okay.
So a drawback is when there is something present that the client or prospect wishes wasn't present, or there's something missing that the client or prospect wishes was there. And so much like skepticism, you have to acknowledge, it sounds like, Mr. Client, you would like X and X doesn't exist. You would like to both get growth and not go down. Did I hear you correctly? You want fat-free chocolate cake, right? Or should I say you want good fat-free chocolate cake?
I'm definitely using that one.
So
I like that.
I've got a lot of them, David. I mean, when you're in the business for over 25 years, and I've had 50,000 conversations, I've done seminars. By the way, this was part of preparing, which we didn't cover, and I won't go too much on it, but having a repertoire of things to pull out of your tool case is things like that will either always get a laugh or always do a pattern interrupt. It's very useful and part of preparing to have a repertoire. DIMES is my new acronym for the objections.
Where'd you get the E from? Or are you pronouncing it dimes and not dims?
I bought a vowel.
I bought a vowel.
I
didn't get paid yet, so I'm not giving you the vowel.
I think dimes, I'll have to find an objection that starts with E, but dimes, because frankly, SMID doesn't really do it for me, and dims doesn't either. So dimes Dropping dimes.
Dropping dimes. I love it. Well, certainly find an E objection and just make sure to Venmo me after this since you're buying a vowel.
You're too expensive. You're too expensive.
So in the last piece, resolve and gain agreement for action. So this is, kind of what this all leads up to is, we're making sure to identify their needs. We're making sure to address objections to ultimately get them to do what they should be doing. And in turn, obviously do what we think they should be doing and getting compensated, for those efforts. Okay. So tell me about the word no and what that means to you if someone says no in some point of the conversation.
No is feedback, and no is very valuable feedback.
So do you think that is what you're saying or about to say that no then goes back to trying to figure out what the objections are if you didn't uncover the objections already, or do you address a no in a different way than kind of where my mind just went?
Differently from the way your mind just went.
Okay, so let's stick with yours and then.
Okay, so let me take a step back and then a step to the side and then a step forward. Okay, step back. Every part of this process, the create, the explore, the address, resolve, is designed to have agreement along the way. So agreement about what we're talking about and what the conversation is for. That's the C in create. Then the E in explore is agreement on a clear, complete, and mutual understanding of your needs. So we've agreed on your needs. Then when we're addressing your objections, we're also addressing needs. And that I'm glad we're going to come back and do a mini. I love the term mini series as well. We'll do a mini series because you could spend definitely a whole episode, maybe even more, just how to address needs and objections, because they're definitely linked together. But we agree on what we're conversations for. We agree on the needs. We agree on the solutions to address those needs. Now we resolve it. We just come up with next steps, and we agree on next steps. So part and parcel of my model is agreement at every level. So the word no, now I'm coming back forward.
Yep.
The word no is feedback along the way. And that's why I say it's feedback. And the way I think about, and I mentioned conversational chess, I think about it like a decision tree. So I move my bishop here or my pawn here or my knight here. There's different ways that they might go as a response. If I'm asking a closed-ended question, it's because I want to get a yes or a no. And I'm looking for no. I'm searching for no, but I'm also searching for yes. But the way the question is asked, or series of questions or sequence of questions, I'm very comfortable with no. I understand that no is very much a natural response. And there's a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss.
Yep.
And I did an episode on this called Seeking No. Anyway, we don't want to tangent too much off of that, but in terms of resolve, if you place yourself on the same side of the table as your client and prospect, no is just telling the two of you together where to take things.
Okay, so it's not that you're comfortable with no because you know, KNOW, that that not everyone's going to become a client. It's more so comfortable with no because you then have a challenge that you have the opportunity to resolve. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, I welcome objections because
you like that. You like that close-ended question?
Yes.
How about that one? Okay.
I welcome objections because it's my job to address objections. I welcome the opportunity to have a dialogue with anybody, anywhere, at any time. The best way to demonstrate my model is through role play. And so I look forward to the mini series where we probably bring on a third person. I nominate Michael Van Sant, and we show the technique in role play in action. It's the best way to demonstrate all of these. But I need to know the answer. Am I sad when someone decides to either not do business with me, or having done business with me for years, leave working with me? I am. I take it like a doctor who loses a patient. Like when I lose a client, I take it really hard. So I don't like that no, but I have to get no along the way to find out if I can get them on board and keep them on board. I need no. No is essential.
Well, to your point, it gives you, like you said, it gives you feedback so that, you understand what the, next step is, or hopefully is, right? So I am also looking forward to the mini series as a reminder of the two acronyms, so that people remember this. So one is CLEAR, create, listen, explore, address, and resolve. And then Ivan, I'll let you go through the dimes or dims, because I had the CLEAR one written down and I don't have this one written down. So I think it's drawback, indifference, misunderstanding, and skepticism. And we're searching for the E. See, the acronym already worked.
Right. And in part one, we talked about the rules. And so we maybe did this last in, first out, but I'm working on book number 2, which I believe will be called Clear Rules for Conversations.
Oh, that's news to me.
You heard it here. I've talked about it on my show briefly, but just briefly. And now that, and you're a big part of this, David, now that I've done an audiobook and I've seen the ease and frankly, the less expensive nature of an audiobook, my next book is going audio first. And maybe a paper copy too, but for the most part, audio rocks. So
I know before I said, and I think this is gonna be funny. So before I said, hey, I got the book, but I really like to listen. Can you make an audio book? And you're like, yes. Okay. So to throw a curveball at you, I like to listen to the books, but I also always buy the hard copy too, so that I can fill a bookshelf. So I'm going to need you to follow through on the actual book too, and not just an audio book for your second one.
I've already anticipated that, David.
Or at least one copy. I just need one copy.
Well, what I didn't do in the first book that I want in the second book is a workbook. And
I like that idea a lot.
And it's true that when you do an audiobook, and so there's many benefits of audiobooks. One of the drawbacks is dropping dimes. One of the drawbacks is you don't have anything to refer to. So if there's a list of open-ended probes, closed-ended probes, you don't have anything to refer to, or flow charts.
Ivan, as we wrap up here, just as a reminder, where can people find you? So we already mentioned the book can be found on Amazon. If you type in Conversations, Ivan Farber, Farber, and where else can they connect with you?
Conversations.biz, B-I-Z, because I'm all about the biz. And then my email address is ivan@conversations.biz. Anyone can feel free to reach out to me at any time. And LinkedIn is a place I play, so I encourage people to follow me or connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter as well. So those are good places to find me.
Ivan, thank you very much for joining again, and excited for what's to come in the mini series that we have alluded to.
Love it. Love it. Thanks for having me.